It wasn't the kind of flight anyone expected to remember, until one quiet passenger turned a routine trip into a reckoning. The crew thought they were in control. They thought they knew who she was. But what they saw was only the surface. Beneath, it was someone who would expose everything they didn't want the world to see. No shouting, no threats, just silence. And then the truth, loud enough to shake the entire airline. You think you know where this is going? You don't. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what do you think really happened on that plane? Dr. Maya Bennett stepped through the jet bridge with calm grace, the heels of her black leather pumps clicking softly against the aluminum floor. She was early, as usual. Her carry-on bag rolled behind her with practiced ease, and her posture erect and poised, radiated professionalism honed by decades in clinical practice. Dressed in a tailored midnight blue blazer over a cream blouse, paired with matching slacks and a soft burgundy scarf, she looked every bit the composed traveler. Her skin glowed against the overhead lights, her neatly styled coils pulled back into a low chignon. She exuded serenity. She also exuded a quiet authority, though not the kind some flight crews were conditioned to recognize. As she entered the aircraft, a cool burst of air conditioning brushed past her face. The scent of leather seats and lemon disinfectant filled the cabin. Two flight attendants stood at the front galley, organizing pre-departure beverages and chatting quietly between glances at the boarding passengers. One of them, a tall brunette in her early 30s with immaculately manicured nails and a tight bun, Heather, gave Maya a quick up and down glance. Her lips twitched. The other, a sandy-haired man with a sharp jaw and visible boredom on his face, smirked without subtlety. "Looks like we got another special guest on this flight today," Heather muttered under her breath, just loud enough for her colleague, Jacob, to hear. Her tone dripped with sarcasm. "Wonder if she wandered in from economy," Jacob replied, chuckling. Maya heard them. She didn't turn her head, didn't slow her stride. She'd been in this moment before, more times than she could count. Whether in conference halls, executive lobbies, or now 30,000 feet in the air, the microaggressions often came with a smile and the assumption that she didn't belong. She approached row 3, scanning for her seat. 3A, business class, aisle. She reached up to slide her carry-on into the overhead bin, her movement fluid and efficient. That's when Heather stepped forward, cutting across the aisle just as Maya lowered herself into her seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," Heather said with a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. "I think you may be in the wrong section." Maya blinked once, then looked down at her boarding pass. Her voice was calm but firm. "No, I'm in the right seat. 3A, business class." She held out the pass, clearly printed and scannable. Heather barely glanced at it, then gave a tight-lipped smile. "One moment, please." She turned on her heel and walked briskly to the front galley. Maya stayed seated. She folded her hands in her lap, letting her breath slow. She could feel the heat of watching eyes, the subtle shift in posture from the man 2 seats over in 3C, the curious turn of a head from row 4. The unspoken question, "What's going on here?" Heather returned within seconds, forcing a laugh that grated against Maya's composure. "Oh, you're right. Just making sure." Some passengers switch rows without realizing it. Her voice was louder now, performative. She walked away without apology. Maya stared straight ahead. No anger showed on her face, only a slow blink and a deepening stillness. Jacob passed by moments later, offering a half-hearted drink menu. He skipped the usual friendly spiel, handed it over without looking her in the eye, then greeted the passenger behind her with a much warmer, "Welcome aboard, sir." His behavior mildly condescending, avoidance of eye contact, invalidation of passenger legitimacy. She paused briefly, then added, "No acknowledgement of mistake. No apology offered." Noted. She clicked the device off, let it rest gently against her thigh, and exhaled slowly. Her tone had been analytical, her wording precise, professional clinical documentation, the kind she had done for years. But behind that discipline was a lifetime of training her voice to sound composed, especially when injustice simmered below the surface. 3 rows up, Jacob leaned out of the galley wall, his arms folded across his chest, watching. Unlike Heather, he didn't bother with pretense. His expression was fixed in a mild scowl, his jaw tense, his posture radiating suspicion. He watched Maya with a kind of smug certainty, as if confident that his assumptions about her were justified by the mere act of her being quietly different. Heather, standing just to his left now, caught his eye and tilted her chin in Maya's direction. "She's talking to herself," Heather whispered. "You see that?" Jacob's lip curled, amused. "Yeah, she'd been muttering ever since she sat down." "Maybe we should keep an eye on her," Heather said, her voice dipping further. "She might be one of those unstable types. You know, triggered by the wrong meal. Next thing you know, she's screaming about the government." Jacob let out a short breath of laughter and shook his head. "Figures. First she tries to grab a seat she doesn't belong in. Now she's whispering into something. God knows what she's packing in that bag." "God forbid it's a therapy crystal," Heather murmured with a chuckle. "Or a journal." "Or a court order," Jacob replied, "for a restraining order against herself." They both snickered. Neither noticed the young man in 3D across the aisle, slowly lowering his AirPods and glancing toward them with narrowed eyes. Nor did they notice the couple behind Maya, a black man and his white partner, both exchanging glances, quiet, tense glances that signaled they too had heard. But Jacob and Heather were no longer whispering out of discretion. They were whispering out of habit. And in their minds, that habit had always been consequence-free. Maya remained still. She didn't need to turn her head. Their voices weren't as quiet as they thought, and even if they had been, she'd long ago trained herself to read tone over volume. She pressed the record button again, still calmly, and added, "Crew conversation audible. Repeated implications regarding mental instability. Persistent assumption of passenger unfitness based solely on race and behavior unfamiliar to them. No effort to engage directly. Behavior consistent with unconscious or possibly conscious bias. Documented." She turned the recorder off once more and leaned back slightly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the seat back ahead. From an outsider's perspective, she appeared to be merely relaxing before takeoff, possibly rehearsing a speech or quietly thinking. The strength in her stillness was an armor she wore without the need for performance. Meanwhile, Jacob stepped forward and began offering drinks row by row. When he reached Maya's seat, he didn't look her in the eye. "Something to drink?" he asked, voice flat. "Sparkling water with lime, please," she replied. Her tone was pleasant but not warm. Not anymore. She was done offering comfort. He returned shortly with her drink, setting it down with a thud harder than necessary on the tray table, enough to make the glass tremble slightly. No smile, no acknowledgement. He moved on to the next passenger without a word. Maya lifted the glass, sipped slowly, and opened her notebook. Not her tablet, not her phone, just a slim moleskin leather journal. Her pen, a black Mont Blanc gifted to her by a grateful client, flowed effortlessly across the page. As she wrote, she made no note of the eyes watching her. Heather had resumed her post near the galley, but kept stealing glances at 3A, whispering again to Jacob, who now leaned in closer. "She's writing now," she murmured. "What is she?" "A courtroom sketch artist." "God," Jacob muttered. "If she starts drawing me, I swear I'm calling security." They both laughed again. "Maybe she's documenting the voices in her head," Heather added. "Maybe we should call it in, just in case." Maya rode on, not lifting her gaze. But something had shifted behind her eyes. That feeling, the cold prickle across her spine that said, "They think you're powerless." She wasn't surprised. She had expected some level of inappropriate behavior, but this crossed a line. They weren't just mocking. They were escalating. She glanced at the call button, then decided against it. Not yet. Let them walk deeper into their own assumptions. Let them expose the rot themselves. Across the aisle, the young man in 3D opened his notes app and typed, "Flight attendants mocking black woman in 3A, saying she's unstable." As she tugged at it, a pen slipped from the outer pocket and rolled across the carpet, stopping inches from Maya's polished shoe. Without hesitation, Maya leaned down, picked up the pen, and tapped the young woman's arm gently to return it. "Here you go," she said with a soft smile. The young woman pulled out her earbuds and blinked in surprise. "Oh, thank you. I didn't even notice." "No problem," Maya replied, already turning back to her journal. But before the moment could settle, Jacob's voice rang out from the galley, loud enough to turn heads several rows up. "Careful now," he called out, walking back into the aisle with a forced chuckle. "Don't want to cause a panic. Would hate for someone to mistake a dropped object for a security issue." His tone was overly bright, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Passengers turned to look, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, and a few, those who had already noticed the prior exchange between Jacob, Heather, and Maya, with knowing unease. Maya didn't flinch. She sat calmly, placing her journal back into her satchel. The young woman looked embarrassed, clearly not understanding the deeper meaning behind the remark. She tucked her backpack away quickly and avoided eye contact. Jacob kept walking, pretending to check seatbacks and overhead compartments, but his eyes remained fixed on Maya as he passed. He stopped just beyond row 4, turned toward the jump seat near the emergency exit, and pulled out the flight crew's internal tablet from the wall holster. He unlocked the screen with a swipe of his badge, tapped into the cabin observation portal, and opened the incident flagging tool. Under the category Passenger Behavior, he selected the tag for possible mental instability and entered short note. Passenger 3A talking to herself, odd behavior, suspicious interaction with surrounding passengers, potentially disruptive. The system auto-tagged the passenger based on her seat and uploaded the alert to the in-flight log, silently triggering a cross-check for any past reports. There were none, but the flag was enough to initiate informal monitoring. Jacob locked the tablet, slipped it back into its mount, and returned to the galley, where Heather was wiping down the service counter with mild interest. "You flagged her?" Heather asked in a low voice. "Yeah," Jacob replied, grabbing a water bottle and twisting off the cap. "Just in case. You never know with these types. Better to be proactive." "She's too calm," Heather said, eyes narrowed toward the front of the cabin. "That kind of silence, it's not normal. Gives me the creeps." "Exactly," Jacob said, leaning back against the galley wall. "And that whispering thing she's doing? Super weird. Could be self-harm language or even a trigger pattern. You'd be shocked how many cases like that go unchecked." Heather nodded solemnly, like they were performing a noble service. Like their suspicion was concern and not bias. Maya, meanwhile, had resumed her quiet demeanor, now sipping from her glass of sparkling water. She could feel the weight of their stares as palpably as if someone had touched her shoulder. The comment about panic had been strategic, a test balloon to gauge passenger reactions and subtly undermine her presence. It was a familiar tactic, create just enough public discomfort to cast someone as a threat without ever making an overt accusation. She'd seen the pattern before. She'd documented it in law enforcement briefings and HR training programs. Now, she was living it mid-flight, wearing calm-like armor while the people tasked with ensuring safety worked to quietly turn suspicion on her. From his aisle seat, the man in 3D, the same one who had lowered his AirPods earlier, watched Jacob with growing unease. He had seen the pen drop. He had seen Maya return it kindly. He had heard the tone of Jacob's voice and recognized it as something more than just a clumsy joke. He turned to his wife in 3E, whispering low. "He's targeting her." "I know," she replied, equally hushed. "It's getting worse." Jacob passed by again under the pretense of checking on meal preferences. He stopped at 3A and tilted his head slightly. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice wrapped in false politeness. "Everything's fine, thank you," Maya answered. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. Jacob nodded, but his eyes lingered a beat too long before moving on. Heather appeared moments later with a small notepad. She scribbled a quick note and handed it to Jacob in the galley. He unfolded it. "Check seat map," it read. "If she causes any problems, we might need to consider a seat safety swap for optics." It was coded language, a maneuver used by crews to discreetly shift problematic passengers to avoid potential escalation, usually without cause, almost always without recourse. Maya continued writing in her journal. Her script was meticulous. The pen traced lines that would later become official reports and formal complaints, but for now, it was her sanctuary. She noted the shift in body language, the tightening of crew smiles when they passed her seat, the stilted tone in Jacob's voice as he tried to mask disdain with authority. She noticed how the passengers nearby grew quieter when she moved, how her every motion seemed to invite attention it didn't warrant. She wrote it all down. Crew has initiated surveillance under assumption of behavioral concern. Incident was staged through public mischaracterization of benign interaction. Bias escalating into coordinated response. The lingering effects of Jacob's deliberate spectacle were still settling like dust. Maya had noticed how passengers near her had grown stiffer, less responsive, avoiding eye contact or casting furtive glances when she shifted in her seat or reached into her bag. Suspicion bred silence, and silence bred complicity. She waited a beat longer, then calmly pressed the call button overhead. The small chime was barely audible over the hum of the engines, but it brought Heather briskly up the aisle, a smile already pasted on her face like stage makeup. "Yes, ma'am," she said, bending just slightly, not in respect but in condescension, a performative gesture reserved for those she deemed unworthy of real courtesy. Maya met her gaze evenly. "I'd like a cup of hot tea, please," she said, her tone as neutral and professional as ever. Heather blinked, then gave a little nod and said, "Of course," before spinning on her heel and retreating to the galley. The word choice was plain. The request was reasonable. But Maya could already sense that the crew would not treat it that way. In the narrow space of the forward galley, Heather opened the drawer of individually bagged teas with a sigh that reeked of impatience. She picked out a packet and dropped it on the counter like it had offended her. Another flight attendant, a younger blonde named Carla, stepped in beside her to collect water bottles for the beverage cart. "Who's that for?" she asked casually, nodding toward the mug Heather was sloppily preparing. "Her," Heather replied with an eye roll, tilting her head toward Maya's seat. The whisperer, Carla, raised an eyebrow, interested. "Didn't Jacob already flag her?" "Yeah, but she's still sipping water like she's Oprah," Heather muttered. "Asked for tea like she's on a spa retreat. Still thinks she belongs in business class, huh?" Her voice was coated in something heavier than sarcasm. There was disdain in it, an undercurrent of irritation that Maya hadn't done something to justify being pushed back to coach. Carla gave a soft laugh, but it faded fast when she noticed a sharply dressed, middle-aged woman standing near the curtain, clearly waiting to use the restroom, and clearly within earshot. The woman gave a slow blink, her expression unreadable, and then stepped forward without a word into the lavatory. Carla cleared her throat and nudged Heather lightly. "You might want to keep it down," she murmured. "People are starting to notice." "Let them," Heather snapped, sloshing hot water into the cup too quickly, letting it spill slightly over the rim. She didn't bother to wipe it down. She dropped the tea bag into the steaming liquid, grabbed a saucer with 2 lemon wedges, no honey, no sugar, no spoon, and marched back down the aisle like she was delivering a punishment instead of a drink. When she reached 3A, she leaned in just far enough to place the cup and saucer on Maya's tray, but her grip tilted slightly at the last second. The cup wobbled, and a splash of scalding water spilled onto the edge of the tray, nearly sliding into Maya's lap. Maya pulled back quickly, not out of panic, but precision. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction. Heather gave a theatrical wince and offered a weak smile. "Oops, hope that didn't startle you." She emphasized the word startle just enough to make it a provocation. Maya said nothing at first. She simply lifted the cup, steadying it in her palm with perfect control, and placed it on a dry napkin from her side pouch. She looked up at Heather, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I'd like some honey. And a spoon." Heather blinked as if surprised by the civility, then nodded curtly and left without apology. Maya didn't follow her with her eyes. She simply waited, slowly dabbing the spilled liquid with the edge of the napkin while the tray still trembled faintly from the jostle. Behind her, the woman who'd overheard the galley conversation had returned to her seat in 4B. She sat stiffly for a moment, then tapped her partner's arm and whispered something into his ear. The man frowned, straightened, and looked toward Maya's seat. He didn't know her. He didn't know what she did for a living or why she was on this flight. But what he had just heard unsettled him. He picked up his phone and began typing. In 3D, the man from earlier who had watched Jacob flag Maya for whispering now leaned toward the aisle slightly, eyeing the teacup and the way Heather had walked away. He had noticed the slight splash. It wasn't an accident. He'd flown enough to know deliberate clumsiness when he saw it. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. He reached for his phone as well. Maya sipped her tea, now slightly cooled, and opened her notebook again. She wrote, "Request for basic service met with delay, passive-aggressive conduct, and deliberate carelessness." Verbal comment implies assumption of fragility or overreaction. Witnessed by multiple passengers. Flight attendant referred to passenger as a disruption in galley conversation, unaware of surrounding company. Systemic disrespect evident in both action and tone. She paused and wrote one more line, bias no longer subtle, escalating toward institutional behavior. Heather returned moments later with a small packet of honey and a plastic spoon, slapping them onto the tray without a word. Maya did not look up. She unwrapped the honey, stirred her tea, and returned to her notes. Heather lingered for a moment as if waiting for a reaction, but when none came, she turned and walked off, her heels clicking against the aisle floor with each step. In the cockpit, Jacob pulled up the flagged incident again on the crew tablet. He noted that Maya had now requested assistance twice, implying that her behavior was increasing in engagement. He left a vague note, "May require observation post-service." That entry would be visible to airline operations on the ground, just enough to hint at an issue without citing anything specific. Another crew member, standing nearby, saw the screen and tilted his head. "That the same woman you mentioned earlier?" Jacob nodded. "She's acting calm now, but we've seen that before. They get agitated when they feel challenged." "You want me to keep watch?" Her notebook sat open in her lap again, and her pen danced quietly over the page. Her handwriting was fluid and intentional, free of tremor or haste. Around her, the passengers were returning to a state of casual inattention, scrolling through devices, flipping through airline magazines, and murmuring idle conversation. But she could still feel the tension coiling in the atmosphere. There was a vibration in the cabin's energy now, the kind that followed cruel jokes whispered just out of reach and hostile glances poorly disguised as professional concern. She didn't need to hear them laughing to know they still were. She could read it in their posture, in the insincere lilt in Heather's voice when she asked others what they'd like for dinner, in the way Jacob made unnecessary trips past a row with a thin excuse of checking a panel or adjusting a latch. They were waiting for her to react. But Maya had learned long ago that silence, when chosen with clarity, could be more powerful than confrontation. That didn't mean she'd remain silent forever. No, her words were coming. She simply knew the value of placing them precisely where they'd hit hardest. A few minutes later, just after the crew began prepping the mid-flight snack service, Jacob reappeared beside a row. He leaned slightly into the aisle, bending low enough that his voice could be heard, but not so low that it came off as intimate. He wore the expression of someone pretending to show concern but radiating suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said with affected kindness. "Just wanted to check in. Are you doing all right? You seem a little unsettled. Need any special assistance?" Maya slowly turned her head toward him, letting her eyes meet his fully for the first time since boarding. Her gaze was not confrontational, but it was direct, sharp, and unreadable, as though peeling back layers without touching a thing. Her voice was level. "I'm doing perfectly fine. Thank you." Jacob nodded, a bit too quickly, clearly not expecting her calm tone. He lingered another second, scanning her tray for evidence of distress, confusion, or discomfort, finding none, then offered a tight smile and moved on. Behind him, Heather stood half-hidden behind the curtains separating first class from business, watching with thinly veiled amusement. When Jacob returned to the galley, she raised an eyebrow. "So?" she asked, like they were gossiping about a classmate behind a cafeteria table. Jacob rolled his eyes, still whispering, still scribbling in that little book like she's diagnosing herself. Carla nearby smirked. Maybe she's writing her own prescription. Or arguing with the voices in her head. Heather added under her breath, trying not to laugh. Imagine being that deep in your own world. She's probably doing some kind of self-therapy, Jacob said with a dramatic air quote. Bet she's one of those fringe types who thinks healing crystals cure trauma. The group snickered quietly. From behind the curtain, one of the catering staff, a man named Rico, who had just handed off a tray of meals, overheard them. He didn't say anything, but his eyes tightened slightly as he listened. He had worked in airline service long enough to know when a crew was turning a passenger into a target. Maya, still in 3A, clicked her recorder back on. She whispered into it evenly, just above the hush of the engine hum. Crew member Jacob initiated passive-aggressive engagement, questioning emotional stability despite absence of symptoms or behavior indicating distress. Use of term special assistance, notable in context, suggests internal judgment. No legitimate grounds for intervention. Observation continues. Laughter and conversation detectable from galley-following interaction. Tone suggests mockery. She clicked the device off and resumed writing in her notebook. She did not look back. She did not flinch. She simply recorded the truth as it unfolded. In row 4B, the same woman who had overheard Heather earlier shifted in her seat again. She pulled out her phone and began jotting down notes, just in case. Her partner leaned over, whispering, "Again?" She nodded. "They're still talking about her." "Disgusting," he muttered. "I've never seen anything like this in business class." In 3D, the man with the AirPods turned his phone slightly, pretending to scroll social media while the camera lens peered discreetly down the aisle. He hit record, angling it so that both Jacob's last approach and Maya's calm demeanor were captured clearly. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew it was wrong. His sister was a therapist. He recognized the tools Maya was using, centering techniques, behavioral journaling, quiet affirmations. These weren't signs of instability. They were signs of training, mastery, professional control. But the crew didn't care. They weren't interested in who Maya was. They had already decided, and now they were trying to shape the narrative to match their prejudice. In the galley, Heather leaned against the counter, watching the coffee drip into a pot. "You think we should report anything?" she asked idly. Jacob shrugged. "Depends. If she causes a scene, it's already documented that we checked on her. If not, no harm done. But better safe than sorry. We can't be blamed for trying." "True," Carla chimed in. "I mean, it's not like we're making it up." But they were. They were building a story from silence, framing calm behavior as suspicious, and layering their own discomfort over someone else's professionalism. Jacob pulled up the incident log again on the crew tablet and added another line. Passenger responded calmly to check-in, but continues self-directed verbal behavior and excessive note-taking. Monitoring recommended. Each interaction was evidence, and each whisper was a line in a case study that was quickly evolving into a live experiment on how unconscious bias becomes weaponized within systems meant to ensure safety. She sensed the turning point the moment it happened, not with a loud outburst or announcement, but with a shift in the air, a silence too pointed to be coincidence. It began in the forward galley, where Jacob stood once again in front of the crew tablet, his brow furrowed in faux concern. His finger hovered for a moment, then pressed a sequence of icons. Crew notes, passenger behavior, in-flight observation. The entry field opened, prompting him to detail any behaviors of concern. He glanced around, as if checking for potential witnesses, but it was clear he already had Heather and Carla's silent endorsement. His fingers moved swiftly over the screen. Passenger 3A continues to demonstrate signs of psychological distress. Repetitive self-directed speech. Inconsistent eye contact with crew. Excessive note-taking. Emotional flatness during interaction. Request evaluation for fitness to fly. The system didn't require proof. It didn't ask for corroboration. The entry was now part of the in-flight safety log, automatically time-stamped and stored. Just like that, Maya was no longer just a passenger. She was now, in the internal language of the airline, a PPI, potential passenger incident, a category that triggered elevated observation and, in rare cases, removal. Jacob set the tablet back in its holster and walked through the first-class curtain with a renewed sense of purpose. He made a beeline for the cockpit, tapping lightly on the door and waiting for the secondary unlock to flash green. When it did, he stepped inside and pulled the door closed. Inside, the captain, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair named Captain Reeves, turned slightly in his chair while the co-pilot managed the current altitude readout. "What's up?" he asked, eyeing Jacob's expression. Jacob kept his tone careful. "We've got a possible issue in 3A. Female passenger traveling alone. Behaviors off. She's been whispering to herself since takeoff, writing things down obsessively, refusing eye contact, showing classic signs of dissociation. I filed an internal observation report. I'd recommend we flag it just in case." Reeves frowned, half skeptical, half concerned. "You think she's a threat?" Jacob shrugged with calculated vagueness. "I wouldn't go that far yet, but if something escalates, we'll need to have shown due diligence. Might be a mental health situation. I just didn't want us caught off guard if she snaps mid-flight." The word snaps was chosen intentionally. No specifics, just a cloud of anxiety large enough to stick. Reeves grunted and made a note on his checklist. "Keep an eye on her. Let me know if anything changes. No mid-air drama today, all right?" "Understood," Jacob replied and slipped out of the cockpit with the expression of a man who had just done his duty. Back in the galley, Heather raised a brow. "He buying it?" "He logged it," Jacob said. "Captain's on alert. All we need is one little push, and we'll have grounds to request removal post-landing. Worst case, she gets flagged in the system for future flights." "Nice," Carla muttered, glancing down the aisle. "She's been way too calm for someone who's supposedly crazy." "That's the thing," Jacob said, lowering his voice. "It's the calm ones you watch. They bottle it up. Then boom." The others nodded like experts. None of them had the clinical training to back their assumptions, but their confidence made their ignorance look convincing. Maya, from her seat, didn't have to hear their conversation to understand what was unfolding. She could feel it, the way Heather now passed her with exaggerated precision, never making eye contact, the way Jacob loitered near the galley curtain more often, subtly peeking in her direction, as if expecting her to combust. But Maya's composure didn't falter. She clicked her recorder back on and whispered calmly into it. Suspected escalation underway. Crew behavior now consistent with targeted narrative construction. Verbal and behavioral cues suggest internal documentation has shifted from observational to adversarial. Recommendation: full audit of crew communication logs, safety system access history, and captain briefings. She paused, then added, emotional state, steady. No deviation. Meanwhile, in 3D, the same man who had recorded Jacob's last conversation watched the sudden uptick in attention toward Maya. He leaned across to his partner. "Something's happening," he whispered. "They're circling her now." "What can we do?" she whispered back. "We don't have any proof." "We might," he said, holding up his phone. "If they try to remove her, I'll post this before we hit the ground." In 4B, the older couple who had overheard Heather in the galley now sat ramrod straight, the woman visibly tense. "They're trying to frame her," she muttered. "I can feel it. They want her off this flight." "She hasn't done anything wrong," her husband whispered. "And she knows it." Maya, meanwhile, remained still, her eyes soft but alert. She flipped to a new page in her notebook and wrote, "Crew escalation pattern aligns with risk protocol manipulation. Behavior labeling process appears designed to justify removal, not ensure safety. Pattern recognized in multiple discrimination case studies. Conclusion: crew has crossed line from observation to targeted harassment." At that moment, Jacob returned to the cabin with a clipboard and moved through the rows, pretending to verify seatbelt compliance and meal preferences. When he reached Maya, he paused. "Everything good here, ma'am?" he asked, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Maya sat upright in 3A, her hands still, her tea now cold, the journal open on her lap like an open court transcript. Her pen rested beside it, and her voice recorder had been slipped quietly back into her jacket pocket. She no longer needed to speak for the story to continue unfolding. The crew had begun writing their own confession in real time, and their audience was no longer passive. Passengers around her had begun exchanging more than glances. The air was charged with tension, thick with recognition that the woman being targeted wasn't irrational, wasn't unstable, and wasn't invisible. Across the aisle in 3C, a young woman who had been quietly watching from behind her tablet now pulled out her earbuds. She looked toward Maya, then toward the galley curtain where Jacob had just ducked back behind moments earlier. Her brows pulled together in a subtle but visible frown. She glanced toward Heather, who stood in the forward galley whispering again with Carla, and her discomfort solidified into action. Her voice was clear, not loud, but just sharp enough to pierce the false calm. "Excuse me," she said, addressing no one in particular, but ensuring it could be heard. "Why is that passenger being monitored like she's done something wrong?" The question hung in the air, simple but seismic. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Jacob froze just behind the curtain and stepped back into the aisle as if summoned by tension. He composed himself instantly and gave a well-practiced smile. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked, as though her comment had been a service request. The young woman didn't look away. "No, I'm just wondering why you keep singling out that woman," she said, nodding subtly toward Maya. "You've walked past her row 6 times. You asked her twice if she needed help, and she's been sitting there quietly the entire time." There was a moment of silence that followed a tense vacuum. Then, from 2 rows behind Maya, a low, commanding voice joined the conversation. "That's because they think black people are suspicious by default," the man said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Maya didn't turn around, but she recognized the voice. It belonged to the older black gentleman in 5B, who had been watching since boarding, eyes sharp and posture straight, dressed in a navy pullover and khakis. He spoke again, his voice growing stronger with each word. "That woman has done nothing but sit quietly, sip her tea, and write in her notebook. And yet your crew has hovered over her like she's a threat. You filed something on her, didn't you?" Jacob blinked, mask cracking for just a second. "Sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss any internal crew protocols," he replied with the fake calm of someone suddenly aware he was on display. "But I assure you, we treat all passengers equally." "Equally," the man echoed, incredulous. "You sure about that?" "Because I've been watching. I've flown this route every month for 15 years, and I know exactly what it looks like when someone's being profiled." A murmur ran through the nearby rows. The woman in 4B turned to her husband and whispered something quickly. In 3D, the man with the AirPods turned his phone so the screen was visible, still recording. Jacob's eyes flicked toward it briefly before returning to the older man, who was now standing. "She's not talking to herself. She's not causing any scene. But I heard your staff mocking her from the galley. Heard one of them say she still thinks she belongs in business class." His gaze shifted now to Heather, who had just stepped into view, mouth slightly open. "Care to explain that?" he asked her. Heather's face flushed immediately. "Sir, I think you may have misunderstood." "No," the man interrupted sharply, voice firm as a gavel. "I didn't misunderstand anything. I've got ears and a memory, and I've had enough of watching good people get harassed for existing." A ripple of quiet agreement ran through the cabin. Another passenger cleared his throat. "I heard that too," he said from row 6. They were making jokes about her, something about her being unstable. Maya remained in her seat, still not speaking. She didn't need to. The narrative was unraveling on its own, the tide finally turning against the people who had tried to bend perception to their will. Jacob tried again, tone slipping from polished professionalism to subtle defense. "Sir, we're simply ensuring the safety and comfort of all our passengers. If someone exhibits behavior that could be interpreted as what?" The older man cut in. "As not smiling enough? As not jumping when spoken to? As being black and minding her business in business class?" He looked around the cabin now. If she were a white woman whispering to herself, scribbling in a notebook, you wouldn't have said a word. That hit hard. Heather shifted uncomfortably. Jacob looked toward the cockpit, weighing whether to pull the captain into this now. It was the moment between confrontation and consequence, a suspended breath in the narrative of power and perception. Maya sat at the center of it all, still and resolute, her expression composed, her notebook closed, but her mind wide open. She was used to the shifting of rooms when truth was finally spoken aloud, and now she could feel the crew scrambling to collect what little control they had left, trying to push the story back into their favor. But the thread had already been pulled, and the seams were unraveling. Jacob took a single step into the aisle, projecting what he likely thought was calm authority, though his voice betrayed a tightness he hadn't shown before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I want to remind everyone that we have protocols in place for a reason. Our crew is trained to manage in-flight safety situations, and I'd like to ask that you allow us to handle any passenger concerns through the proper channels." He paused, as if expecting applause or compliance. What he got was a cold stare from the older man in 5B, who hadn't sat down. "Sounds like you're trying to silence the people calling you out," the man said plainly, his voice still steady and strong. "Because the only safety concern here is how your crew is treating that woman." A few murmurs of agreement rose again. Jacob held up his hands in a pantomime of peace. "I assure you, sir, this isn't personal," he said. "We follow FAA guidelines. We're simply observing behavior that could present risks if left unmonitored." "So writing in a notebook and keeping to herself is a red flag now," the woman across the aisle snapped. "Because that's the only thing I've seen her do all flight." Jacob's composure cracked just slightly, his smile slipping for a beat before returning. "Again, we appreciate your concern, but we ask that you trust the professionals." He turned as if to walk away, but not before Heather stepped forward from the galley, her tone sharper than Jacob's and her expression tinged with something less controlled. "There are consequences for interfering with crew procedures," she said, her voice clipped. "We're trying to maintain order, and spreading misinformation could compromise safety." The room bristled. Maya didn't move, but she sensed it, the shift from suspicion to desperation. The crew was now defending their story not because it was true, but because it was the only defense they had. Heather took a single step closer to Maya's seat, her words aimed directly at her now, though her voice remained at the same volume, loud enough to be heard by others, but delivered in that honeyed tone that people use when their threats were a veil of civility. "You should know," she said lightly. "Some behaviors can get people added to a no-fly list. Not all of them need to be aggressive, just concerning. Sometimes it's just a pattern." Maya looked up slowly, her eyes meeting Heather's with the kind of steady silence that made the air vibrate between them. She didn't respond, not yet, but she watched her unblinking, as if memorizing her face for a moment that hadn't arrived yet. "Of course," Heather continued, "I'm sure that's not your intention, but it's good to be aware of how these things work." Her smile was as fake as polished glass. The silence that followed was louder than the engines. Maya finally spoke, her voice low but unmistakably clear. "I'm very aware of how these things work." There was no emphasis, no tone of anger, just certainty. Heather blinked, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. From the back rows of business class, someone stood up, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a firm stance. "I've been a federal civil rights attorney for 25 years, she said loudly enough to command attention. "And I'm pretty sure what I've witnessed in the last hour would be considered discriminatory profiling in any court with a conscience." She looked directly at Heather. "So unless that passenger has made a threat, committed a disruption, or violated FAA law, I suggest you stop implying that her quiet behavior is criminal." Heather's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Jacob moved quickly, stepping between them. "Ma'am, please, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time," the woman cut in. "Because if you're going to file fake incident reports and manipulate protocol to target someone, you should at least have the guts to admit it to the rest of the plane." The cabin shifted again, passengers straightening, eyes narrowing, camera phones now openly visible. Jacob and Heather exchanged a look, a flicker of panic masked as professionalism. The narrative was no longer theirs. In 3-8, Maya remained seated, watching, absorbing, recording not just with her device, but with her mind. She saw how power slipped when confronted with truth, how arrogance turned brittle when stripped of control. She knew the pattern because she taught it, documented it, and dismantled it in executive trainings across the country. But now she was living it. And her silence was no longer just resilience. It was the center of gravity that the entire flight now orbited. She reached into her jacket again and clicked her recorder back on. Crew escalated rhetoric from passive aggression to subtle threat. Implied criminalization of non-disruptive behavior. Bystanders initiated vocal defense. Legal authority present among passengers. Cabin narrative shifting rapidly toward public accountability. Jacob and Heather had both retreated to the galley, murmuring in frantic tones. The civil rights attorney had sat back down, not in defeat, but in calculated patience. Her presence, now a silent warning. Passengers whispered among themselves, some filming, others simply watching with narrowed eyes and tense shoulders, as if they knew a reckoning was due and they didn't want to miss the moment it arrived. That moment came just minutes later when the cockpit door opened, and Captain Reeves stepped into the cabin with the expression of a man summoned from authority into a mess he hadn't expected to navigate. He was tall, barrel-chested, and moved with the stiffness of someone who still thought presence equal control. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked halfway down the aisle, eyes scanning the rows, until he stopped in front of Maya's seat in 3A. He turned slightly, addressing not just her, but the passengers, now watching closely. "I'm Captain Reeves," he said calmly, voice measured, "and I've been informed of a potential situation involving a passenger in this section. I've stepped out of the cockpit to observe it firsthand and determine whether further action is needed." His eyes shifted to Maya, waiting. Jacob and Heather lingered nearby, expectant. This, they thought, was the moment their narrative would solidify. The captain would see Maya's odd behavior, listen to their accounts, and confirm their course of action. The removal would be justified, if not celebrated. But Maya didn't speak right away. She took a breath, unbuckled her seatbelt, and slowly stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just deliberately, with the calm authority of someone used to commanding rooms. She turned to face the captain directly, her chin level, her posture impeccable. "Captain Reeves," she said clearly, her voice smooth and audible throughout the first few rows, "my name is Dr. Maya Bennett. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience in behavioral analysis, trauma response, and crisis intervention. I'm also a lead consultant for Unity Air's Mental Wellness and Crew Resilience Program, your airline's own internal wellness division. My employee ID and credentials are available if needed." The silence was immediate and absolute. Every head within 10 rows turned. Jacob's face drained of color, so fast it was like someone flipped a switch behind his eyes. Heather's mouth opened in a tiny breath, her expression unreadable as she instinctively took a step backward. Even the captain hesitated, blinking once, then twice, as if recalibrating everything he'd been told. Maya continued, her voice steady but never confrontational. "For the past 90 minutes, I've been quietly documenting a disturbing pattern of bias-driven behavior directed toward me by members of your flight crew. I have audio recordings and handwritten notes detailing passive-aggressive treatment, mockery, veiled threats, and what appears to be a fabricated incident report submitted to your internal system labeling me a potential psychological concern." She let that sit for a beat, her gaze unwavering, none of which was based on actual behavior, but instead on assumption, prejudice, and systemic conditioning that needs urgent redress. A collective inhale passed through the cabin like a gust of wind. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. The gravity of Maya's words filled every crevice of space between the seats. The captain's face shifted, a tightness in his jaw betraying sudden discomfort. "Dr. Bennett, I wasn't aware of your role with the airline," he began. "I'm not required to disclose my position to travel," Maya replied, her tone even. "And I chose not to because I wanted to see, unfiltered, how your staff responds to passengers who don't conform to their assumptions. What I experienced confirmed what countless complaints in your HR system already suggest, but are rarely acted upon." Jacob stepped forward, stammering slightly. We were following protocol. You were building a case," Maya said, turning her gaze on him now. "One rooted in bias and cloaked in procedure. You interpreted silence as instability. You treated calmness as threat. You manipulated safety protocol to justify surveillance, all while mocking me behind curtains you assumed protected you. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. She wasn't angry. She was precise, clinical, devastating. "Captain," she said, turning back to Reeves, "I suggest you check the log entry Jacob submitted. Cross-reference it with the cabin footage from the internal camera located above row 3. You'll find no disruptive behavior, no escalation, no grounds for concern, except for what your staff created themselves." Reeves cleared his throat. "I will do that. Immediately. And while you're at it," Maya added, "review audio from the forward galley. You may also wish to consult passenger testimonies. Several have recorded parts of this flight and will likely share them with legal representatives." She glanced at the civil rights attorney in 4A, who nodded slightly in return. "I'm aware," Reeves said, voice tighter now. "This is serious." "It's not just serious," Maya said. "It's a liability." Another pause. Then Maya slowly sat back down, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm fine to continue this flight without further incident. But if any additional crew member approaches me without just cause, I will consider it continued harassment and pursue escalation through legal channels. Do you understand?" Reeves swallowed. "Yes, I understand." He turned to Jacob and Heather, his expression hard now. The tension that once belonged solely to Maya had now shifted, displaced like a storm that had drifted downwind and settled over the crew. What was once whispered in galleys and exchanged through knowing glances was now openly questioned in the cabin, where silence had surrendered to solidarity. The atmosphere pulsed not with hostility, but with something more corrosive to those who wore false authority: accountability. Captain Reeves had retreated to the cockpit with a quiet promise to review everything, though the stiffness in his posture on the way back told a story of a man who had just realized he'd walked into something far deeper than he expected. He might have still believed protocol would protect the airline, but everyone else knew better now. The plane itself felt different. In row 3C, the young woman who'd first spoken up leaned forward and caught Maya's attention with a gentle nod. "I'm sorry they did that to you," she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity but stripped of pity. "I've never seen anything like that on a flight before. I didn't know people could be treated like that and nobody would say anything." Maya offered a soft, respectful smile in return. "You said something," she replied, calm but firm, "and that matters." Behind them, the man in 5B, whose voice had helped unearth the full truth, remained standing. His arms were crossed, his gaze fixed on Jacob, who now moved stiffly through the cabin with the clipboard he'd once wielded like a badge of power. That clipboard now looked like a shield too thin to hold back what was coming. "Hey," someone said from 6A, a man in his 30s with a crew cut and a weary look. "If this was about safety, why was she the only one monitored?" Another voice joined in. "And why was your crew laughing about it?" "I heard that. That's not protocol. That's prejudice." Carla, who had remained in the galley for most of the confrontation, now peeked out, pale and clearly unsettled. Her previous confidence had crumbled under the weight of exposure. Heather stood further back, holding a service tray she hadn't touched in 10 minutes, her lips pressed so tightly together that they'd lost all color. In 4B, the older woman from earlier pulled out a folded piece of paper from her handbag and handed it discreetly to Maya as she passed on her way to the lavatory. "That's my contact," she whispered. "If this turns into anything legal, I'll submit a statement. I heard them mocking you. I saw how you were treated." Maya accepted the paper with a nod, sliding it into her journal. The journal that once drew suspicion now sat open like a badge of justice, its neat pages filled with the kind of evidence no system could twist. In 3D, the man with the phone finally stood and walked quietly up the aisle. He stopped at Maya's row, leaned slightly so his voice wouldn't carry too far. "I recorded almost everything. If you need a copy, it's yours. I saw what they tried to do." "Thank you," Maya said. "That kind of awareness helps everyone." He nodded and returned to his seat. Jacob stopped at 3B, pretending to take notes from an imaginary interaction. His hand trembled slightly. The clipboard wasn't steady anymore. The once smug gleam in his eyes had turned into a dull, hollow sheen, the look of someone who had lost his grip not just on the situation, but on the image of himself as competent. He couldn't understand how everything had unraveled so fast, how a passenger he'd labeled as unstable had turned out to be one of the airline's own senior consultants, how his actions, so casually confident just an hour ago, were now being cross-examined by dozens of witnesses, several of whom had recordings, legal expertise, and zero fear of authority. In the galley, Heather finally broke the silence between her and Carla. "They're turning on us," she whispered, voice tight. "They're acting like we're criminals." Carla didn't respond right away. She looked out toward the cabin and said, "We didn't follow protocol. We followed Jacob." That truth stung, and it was too late to walk it back. Jacob returned to the front of the cabin, where Heather met him with a look of shared panic. "What do we do?" she asked, trying to keep her voice low. "Captain's watching," Jacob hissed. "We hold our ground. Don't admit anything. Don't answer questions. Let it settle." "It's not going to settle," Carla muttered as she passed by, pushing the beverage cart like a ghost through a battlefield. The service that had once commanded calm now looked absurd in contrast to the firestorm that had been ignited. Passengers were no longer interested in coffee or pretzels. They wanted answers. In 6D, a teenage girl leaned into the aisle. "I saw her earlier. She was just writing in her notebook. You guys looked at her like she was dangerous. That was wrong." Her mother nodded. "You scared my daughter more than that woman ever did." A chorus of agreement followed, whispered at first, but building. Questions, statements, side conversations that painted the crew as perpetrators, not protectors. Maya listened to it all, saying nothing. Her silence no longer made her a target. It made her the center of a quiet storm. Her authority, once dismissed, had been proven undeniable. Her calm, once misread as fragility, had become a force field. She turned to her notebook once again and began to write. Public opinion shift complete. Narrative no longer controlled by crew. Multiple passenger witnesses have aligned independently. Video evidence confirmed. Support vocalized. Crew composure destabilized. Attempt to re-establish authority via standard procedure ineffective. Emotional state. Composed, vigilant. She clicked her pen and sat back again, folding her hands in her lap. The steady thrum of Flight 372's engines carried the plane forward through unchanging skies. But the turbulence inside the cabin was no longer a matter of air pressure. It was procedural, systemic, and invisible to most passengers until the moment it broke the surface. But now, well past cruising altitude and long after the veil of normalcy had shattered, the situation had reached beyond the sealed fuselage. In an airline operations center several states away, inside a temperature-controlled communications hub lit by monitors and split screens, a systems alert pinged on the desk of Supervisory Flight Operations Coordinator Raymond Kruger. He was halfway through his third cup of lukewarm coffee when the message flashed across a screen. Flagged. PPI escalation from Flight 372 business class incident. Passenger complaints logged. Potential compliance violation. At first, he frowned, assuming it was another minor customer service request escalated too early by a jumpy crew member. But as he opened the message, he noticed the sheer number of passenger-generated tags and the attachment of 2 short in-flight video clips recorded in real time and uploaded via Wi-Fi by passengers. He clicked on the first. The screen showed a woman, seated calmly in business class, speaking with authority. Her tone was cool, professional, and unshakably measured as she delivered a detailed breakdown of her credentials, citing herself as Dr. Maya Bennett, licensed clinical psychologist and Unity Air's contracted wellness consultant. She identified the crew's discriminatory behavior, the fabricated incident reports, and the deliberate misuse of internal protocol. The clip ended with a quiet but damning sentence. "What I experienced confirmed what your HR system already knows, but rarely addresses." Kruger froze, his stomach dropping. He recognized the name immediately. Maya Bennett had been involved in several recent consultations with Unity Air's upper management, evaluating crew morale and post-pandemic recovery protocols. She wasn't just some passenger. She was embedded into the company's new well-being strategy, an expert whose job was to assess crew behavior under pressure. And they had profiled her. on camera. He exhaled slowly and typed a short escalation command into the system, flagging the case for high-priority legal review. He attached the videos and complaint logs and forwarded them with a direct message to the Executive Director of Wellness and Resilience, Cynthia Harper, who at that moment was in the middle of a meeting reviewing upcoming training modules for flight staff. Cynthia's tablet buzzed with the subject line, "Urgent Dr. Maya Bennett flagged as PPI by in-flight crew." Her brow furrowed. She clicked the link. Then her breath stopped. She watched the video of Maya identifying herself, her calm presence cutting through the noise of the flight like a scalpel through fiction. Cynthia didn't finish the second clip before rising from her chair and walking directly to the legal division's corner office. "We've got a situation," she said, no emotion in her voice, just certainty. Within minutes, a preliminary legal folder was created and populated with timestamps, passenger recordings, internal logs, and audio captures already pulled from the plane's communication system. From the brief crew note Jacob had submitted earlier, it was already clear that the justification for Maya's flagging as a possible unstable passenger lacked any foundation. Worse, the language was vague and subjective, excessive note-taking, unusual quietness, self-directed speech, all terms that, in context, would not hold up under scrutiny, especially with video evidence to the contrary. Cynthia tapped her screen and recorded a short message. "Maya, I've been alerted to what's happened mid-flight. I'm escalating this immediately. I will ensure this is handled before you land. We stand with you." She hit send. Back in the air, Maya's phone buzzed lightly on her tray table. She glanced at it briefly and saw the notification from Cynthia, but didn't open it. Not yet. She knew what it was. She could feel the wave building below her now. Down the aisle, Jacob was seated in the jump seat near the galley, his head slightly bowed, tablet in hand. As he scrolled through the system, no longer sure what was being logged or who was watching, Heather sat across from him, her arms folded tightly, face pale, lips pressed together so hard they'd nearly disappeared. Neither of them spoke. They were no longer playing offense. They were bracing for the consequences. "You think they've figured out who she is yet?" Heather finally whispered. Jacob didn't respond right away. Then he said, "If they haven't, they will when we land." "You think we'll get fired?" she asked, more desperate than curious. Jacob's reply came without looking up. "I think we'll be lucky if that's all that happens." In row 3C, the young woman who had initially spoken up now opened her email app, attached the video she'd recorded earlier, and sent it directly to Unity Air's customer relations inbox, subject line, "Discrimination aboard Flight 372 evidence." She wasn't the only one. 5 others around the cabin, encouraged by the collective energy, began uploading their footage and notes. It wasn't a coordinated effort. It didn't need to be. It was truth demanding to be heard from multiple voices all at once. In the cockpit, Captain Reeves received a discreet system message from operations. "Crew conduct under review. Legal notified. Stand by for ground protocol." He read the line twice, then sighed, dragging a hand across his face. The decision had been made for him. This wouldn't be a quiet landing and a forgettable debrief. There would be inquiries, paperwork, disciplinary hearings. And worse, he knew it wasn't just a procedural misstep. It was personal. His crew had taken a woman meant to help them become better and treated her like a threat because she had dared to sit in silence and not play the role they expected. Back in 3A, Maya finally unlocked her phone and opened Cynthia's message. Her face didn't change as she listened, but the slight nod at the end said everything. Additionally, upon arrival, "We'll be met by airline management and law enforcement to address an internal matter. We ask that all passengers remain calm and follow crew instructions as we deplane." The cabin, already on edge, responded in collective silence first, a kind of stillness that doesn't come from surprise but from confirmation. Those who had watched the events unfold, who had questioned, recorded, whispered, now sat upright, their awareness shifting into a new register. The moment had arrived. The truth wasn't just something discussed between rows anymore. It was landing with them. In 3A, Maya remained exactly as she had been since the beginning. Composed, quiet, measured. Her journal lay closed on her lap, her hands folded neatly over it, her back straight. She didn't flinch at the captain's words, nor did she need to. Every passenger around her looked toward her in silent understanding. Some nodded. Some leaned back with the kind of satisfaction that only comes when justice begins to tip back toward balance. In the galley, Jacob's face had gone sheet white. His hand gripped the edge of the counter as he stared at the closed curtain, his other hand clutching the tablet that now felt more like evidence than a tool of authority. He didn't speak, didn't blink. His breath was shallow, and his knees locked in a subconscious effort to hold himself together. "Law enforcement," Heather whispered sharply from beside him, her voice ragged with panic. "They're bringing in law enforcement. Management too," Carla added softly, her voice low and laced with something close to resignation. "They're not just checking notes. They're coming because of her." "Because she's one of them," Heather snapped, though the accusation had lost all venom, reduced now to a whimper of self-preservation. "She's corporate. She set us up." "She didn't set you up," Carla said, her tone dull. "You set yourself up. You assumed. You escalated. We all saw it. We heard it. You pushed a lie until it hit a wall." Heather stared at her as though betrayed, but Carla looked away, folding her arms as if she were cold, even though the cabin temperature hadn't changed. In the rows behind Maya, passengers stirred. Phones had long since returned to hands, not for distraction, but for documentation. A woman 3 rows back quietly opened her voice memo app and began dictating everything she had witnessed, her voice clear but hushed. "This is passenger in seat 6C. The black woman in 3A was harassed by multiple crew members without cause. I observed crew members mock her, question her seating, and create tension around her silence. She was calm the entire time." The man in 3D pulled up his file folder and renamed the video clip. Flight 372 witness account. In 4A, the civil rights attorney reopened her tablet and began drafting a brief outline to send to her firm's legal assistant. She didn't yet know if Maya would want to press charges, but she was preparing for the possibility as a professional and as a witness. "Statement from 4A," she typed. "Observed targeted escalation against Dr. Maya Bennett, an airline wellness consultant. Intervened after veiled threat by flight attendant. Incident now under review by airline management." As the plane descended through a layer of low clouds, Chicago's skyline flickered through the windows, sharp, metallic, a reminder of the grounded reality they were returning to. There would be no hiding behind altitude or airspace anymore. On the flight deck, Captain Reeves received a final ground update through his comms. Gate team assembled. Legal present. Security advised and briefed. Passenger Bennett identified. Awaiting your arrival. He confirmed the message, leaned back in his seat, and exhaled deeply. This flight would be one he remembered, not for the route, not for the weather, but for the confrontation that exposed just how deeply bias could penetrate even the most structured environments. He didn't yet know what would happen to his crew, but he was certain something would. As the wheels lowered and the runway approached, Jacob stood one last time. His steps were wooden, his face drawn. He walked past Maya's row without looking at her, without stopping. For the first time, he realized she wasn't the story he had tried to create. She was the truth they had tried to erase. And she was still there, unmoved. As the landing gear touched down and the plane roared across the tarmac, Maya opened her journal again. The descent had ended, but the reckoning was just beginning. She wrote, "Descent initiated. System accountability confirmed." The forward galley curtain pulled back, and through the narrow doorway stepped 3 individuals, each wearing an expression that suggested this was not just a procedural stop. The first was a tall woman in a gray blazer, her ID badge clearly visible on a lanyard marked Unity Air Executive Division. Behind her, a uniformed airport security officer stepped in, his presence calm but unmistakably official, eyes scanning the aisle as he took mental inventory of the faces watching him. And following him, a third figure, a man in a sharp suit, slim tablet in hand, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had already read every file. Legal. The atmosphere shifted. In row 3A, Maya lifted her gaze, her spine straight, her face unreadable. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the moment their eyes met hers, the woman in the gray blazer nodded in acknowledgement, not out of politeness, but out of respect. "Dr. Bennett," the executive said, her voice low and steady, audible to the front half of the cabin, but directed solely to Maya. "We'd like to speak with you as soon as the plane is cleared. We appreciate your patience." Maya nodded once. No more was needed. The executive stepped aside and turned to Jacob and Heather, who stood near the galley with tension wrapped around their shoulders like weighted vests. Jacob's posture had collapsed inward, his clipboard gone, his jaw tight. Heather, still trying to maintain a shred of composure, squared her shoulders, but couldn't keep her eyes from flicking anxiously toward the passengers, who were very clearly not looking away. "Jacob Maddox," Heather Lang, the legal observer said, voice neutral but firm. "We'd like to speak with you both off the aircraft. Now." It wasn't a request. Jacob hesitated for a second too long. Can we just get our statements first?" he asked, his voice thinner than before. "We have notes. Context." "That won't be necessary," the legal rep replied, not even looking up from his tablet. "You'll have the opportunity to speak in a formal setting. Please step into the jet bridge." Heather shot one last glance at Maya as she gathered herself, but Maya didn't return it. She had already moved past the phase where she gave power to looks. She stayed focused, hands still on her lap, her breath even. Jacob and Heather were led down the aisle and out of the cabin, the officer walking just behind them, not touching, not threatening, but they're all the same. And as they disappeared from view, a subtle sound rippled from the rows behind Maya. It wasn't cheering. It wasn't applause. It was something quieter but heavier. A collective exhale. Vindication doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes as silence reclaiming dignity. A few passengers glanced toward Maya. The woman in 3C gave her a small, respectful nod. The older man in 5B offered her a thumbs up. The civil rights attorney in 4A gave a quiet smile and returned to her tablet, already preparing her official notes. Maya stood only when the aisle cleared, her movements graceful, deliberate, still calm. She gathered her journal, slipped her pen into the spine, and checked that her phone was recording one last time. Documentation was still necessary, not because she expected chaos, but because her life had taught her to finish the record. She stepped into the galley where the executive waited. "We've arranged a private lounge," the woman said quietly. "Legal and HR are there now. You won't need to go through the main terminal." "That's fine," Maya said, her voice level. "But I'd like to speak to the captain before I leave the jet bridge." "Of course," the executive replied. "He's been notified." Maya stepped off the plane, her heels making clean contact with the jet bridge floor. She felt a cool air shift as she exited the aircraft, the sealed bubble behind her giving way to the real world, the world where truth, exposure, and justice finally caught up to policy. Behind her, passengers slowly began to gather their belongings, the energy in the cabin charged with whispered commentary, quiet disbelief, and shared recognition that they had been witness to something extraordinary. One by one, passengers who had once looked away now looked toward one another with connection, a communal understanding that what they had seen mattered, that silence would not have sufficed. A woman from row 6 turned to the teen in 6D. "I'm glad you said something," she said quietly. The girl nodded. "I'm glad she didn't stop." In the cockpit, Captain Reeves watched the terminal through the windshield, arms folded, shoulders set. He had not stepped out to greet the legal team. He had made his call when he let Maya be treated as a subject rather than a consultant. And now, the cleanup had begun. He would answer questions, file his report, but he knew the center of this storm had never been in the airspace. It had always been inside the plane, in the assumptions they carried, the authority they abused, and the woman they underestimated. In the lounge, Maya sat at a table with the executive and the legal observer. Her statements were calm, concise, clear. She played portions of the audio, showed timestamps in her journal, and confirmed names and details. Every line reinforced what was already evident. She had been surveilled without cause, mocked for her quiet, and threatened under the guise of procedure. "You'll receive a formal apology from the airline," the executive said, her voice steady but not cold. "This will result in disciplinary review. We're initiating a top-down audit." "Good," Maya said, "but it's not enough." The first video hit social media within minutes of the plane's arrival at the gate. Shot from row 3D, the clip captured Maya in mid-sentence as she identified herself to the captain. Her calm voice, the mention of her credentials, the accusation of fabricated reports, the ripple of passenger recognition, every beat of it framed with a raw clarity that needed no embellishment. The caption beneath it read, "She wasn't a threat. She was their therapist." And they tried to silence her. Within 20 minutes, it had over 50,000 views. By the end of the hour, that number climbed to 200,000. A second video surfaced next, this time from 5BS perspective, focused on the moment Heather warned Maya. "Some behaviors can get people on a no-fly list, you know." The camera caught Maya's slow blink, her stillness, the cold precision of her reply. "I'm very aware of how these things work." The comment threads exploded. Hundreds of voices condemning the flight crew, expressing outrage, sharing personal experiences of profiling in travel, in retail, in public spaces. By the time Maya arrived at her downtown hotel, the lobby TV, muted but broadcasting closed captions, flashed her face across a national news churn. "Airline bias exposed mid-flight. Therapist confronts crew discrimination in viral video." Maya's phone buzzed nonstop. Texts from colleagues, allies, even strangers. Cynthia had already messaged again. "We're going public with support. Legal's preparing a full press package. You're not alone in this." In the quiet of her room, Maya set her journal on the desk, opened her laptop, and clicked into the storm. She didn't flinch at the spotlight. She studied it. Each reposted clip, each article link, every tweet carrying hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack, #MayaBennett, #UnityAirTruth. This wasn't just a moment, it was a shift. And she had to choose what to do with it. The airline's first public statement appeared on their official website just after 4 p.m., a carefully worded page posted under News and Press. Unity Air acknowledges a reported incident aboard Flight 372 involving Dr. Maya Bennett, a respected mental health professional and consultant to our wellness division. "We are conducting an internal investigation into allegations of misconduct by crew members and will act swiftly based on findings. We are committed to fairness, safety, and equity at every altitude." It was clinical, distant. It said everything without admitting much. And it wasn't enough. The backlash was immediate. Commenters flooded the airline's social media. "Don't just acknowledge, apologize. This isn't a PR crisis. It's a human one. She was helping you. You tried to humiliate her. How many passengers don't have a title or proof and are treated worse?" A major news network aired the story at primetime. A split screen showed the two now viral clips with the headline, "When calm is criminalized, the in-flight silence that spoke volumes." A panel of analysts discussed the implications: implicit bias in air travel, procedural abuse, the danger of unchecked authority in confined spaces. Maya's credentials were validated on-screen, her work history shown with emphasis. One anchor, voice solemn, noted, "Dr. Bennett wasn't simply mistreated. She was profiled by the very system she was helping to reform." By midnight, Maya's inbox held invitations from 4 national news shows, 3 advocacy panels, and 2 educational summits. Her LinkedIn gained 20,000 followers overnight. And yet, she didn't rush to respond. Instead, she took out her notebook, flipped to a clean page, and began again. Viral exposure achieved. Public empathy ignited. Narrative control confirmed. Institutional response insufficient. Demand for accountability escalating. Emotional state clear, prepared. Meanwhile, behind corporate doors, the airline's executive leadership was in triage mode. The videos weren't going away. Neither were the calls for transparency. Within the internal chat logs, HR managers reviewed timestamps, legal consulted with crisis PR, and the director of training called an emergency session to review bias protocols. Ironically, the very program Maya had tried to strengthen 3 months prior and was denied funding for. Now, executives scrambled to reframe that same proposal as a priority. In a closed conference room, the VP of operations rubbed his temples and muttered, "She warned us. She gave us the blueprint. And we ignored it." Meanwhile, Heather and Jacob were suspended pending a full investigation, removed from the active schedule, and summoned to HR with legal counsel. Their union reps present, both were informed that video evidence contradicted their reports, and that passenger testimonies corroborated claims of mockery and bias. Heather wept. Jacob refused to speak. Neither of them had imagined it could turn like this, that their instincts, which had always gone unchecked, would now be held up for the world to scrutinize. Back in her hotel room, Maya finally opened one of the email invitations, a primetime interview offer from a major network. She read the message twice. Then she opened her notes and began drafting. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. This was about policy, about culture, about the quiet violence of perception, about the danger in seeing Black composure as threat and professionalism as performance. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was preparing change. 3 weeks after Flight 372 touched down in Chicago, Maya Bennett stepped into a different terminal at a different airport, dressed in the same quiet elegance that once made her the target of scrutiny, but now drew admiration instead. Her midnight blue blazer and crisp white blouse carried no insignia, no title badge, no visible proof of position, yet she walked like someone who had nothing left to prove. The difference this time wasn't her. It was the world around her that had shifted. Since the videos went viral, the air had changed, not just online or in corporate boardrooms, but in public spaces, in training rooms, in the consciousness of people who once ignored how injustice hides in routine. Maya hadn't flooded news cycles with outrage. She'd made her presence felt by holding the line, by refusing to be shaken. Her interview on primetime had aired just 5 days earlier, and by the end of its broadcast, over 6 million viewers had tuned in live. She'd sat in a clean studio, the interviewer respectful but not performative, asking her the questions that the world had been shouting into headlines. What were you thinking when it happened? How did you stay calm? What do you want people to take away from this? And Maya, steady as ever, had answered not with rage but clarity. "I wasn't surprised," she'd said plainly. "I was disappointed. I didn't raise my voice because that wasn't the battle. The real fight is deeper than one flight. It's in the policies that allow behavior like that to go unchecked. It's in how we interpret silence, how we code who belongs where. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen to the next person who can't pull out credentials or speak calmly under pressure. Not everyone gets that privilege." Her words cut through the screen, not sharp but surgical. They resonated because they weren't for show, they were strategy. The airline had responded in full the next morning. Unity Air's CEO stood in front of a row of cameras and read a prepared statement. Eyes steady, voice sober. "We failed a member of our own team. We failed a guest. But more than that, we revealed a system in need of change. Effective immediately, Unity Air will implement the recommendations proposed by Dr. Maya Bennett. These include comprehensive bias training for all flight staff, a new third-party review system for in-flight incident reports, and the launch of a passenger equity task force led by Dr. Bennett herself. The final announcement wasn't merely symbolic. It had weight, and people noticed. Jacob and Heather were officially terminated, their dismissals cited for cause after investigation. The airline didn't protect them, didn't shield their names, didn't push them into quiet resignation. Instead, their actions were listed in a publicly released HR summary. Falsified behavioral concern reports, recorded mockery of a passenger, violation of internal protocol. Accountability had become the new policy. Now, as Maya stepped toward the boarding gate for Flight 648 to Washington, D.C., she passed a digital screen showing a looping video. Unity Air's new Respect at Altitude campaign. It featured a diverse array of passengers and crew, the text overlay simple. Every voice belongs. Every seat deserves dignity. She paused for a moment, watching the screen flicker. Not for ego, not for validation, but for confirmation that the flight she took weeks ago hadn't ended on the runway. It had taken off. She scanned her boarding pass, and the gate agent looked up, blinking as her name registered. "Dr. Bennett, she asked softly, her tone shifting instantly into warmth. "Welcome aboard. We're honored to have you flying with us today." "Thank you," Maya replied, her smile gentle. "I'm happy to be here." As she walked down the jet bridge, she didn't feel watched this time. She felt seen, and that difference mattered. When she stepped onto the aircraft, the purser, a middle-aged Latina woman with silver streaks in her hair, stepped forward. "Good afternoon, Dr. Bennett. My team has been briefed. We're grateful for the work you've done. If there's anything you need, just say the word." Maya nodded with quiet gratitude. "Thank you. I'm just here to fly." She made her way to seat 2A, first class, once again, and sat with the same quiet dignity she always carried. But this time, no one questioned it. No one whispered. The flight attendant offered her sparkling water with a genuine smile and no hesitation. Across the aisle, a man leaned over slightly and said, "I saw your interview. You spoke for a lot of us." Maya nodded, her voice low. "I just told the truth." As the plane pushed back from the gate and rolled toward takeoff, Maya opened her journal, flipped past the pages from Flight 372, and began writing anew. New flight, different altitude, policy shift confirmed, visibility high, resistance transformed into reform, emotional state, grounded, determined. Outside, the engines roared to life, lifting the aircraft into a calm blue sky. And as the ground fell away, Maya closed her eyes, not to retreat, but to rest just for a moment, knowing she had already changed the course of more than one journey. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but sometimes the truth, spoken plainly and held firmly, becomes a beacon others follow. Not because it yells the loudest, but because it doesn't break under pressure. She had endured the scrutiny of suspicion, the sting of being misread, the weight of proving her own humanity in the face of practiced indifference. And still she rose, elegant, prepared, unshaken. The flight continued on, the seatbelt light glowing quietly overhead. Somewhere behind her, new passengers began their own journeys, unaware that the space they now moved through had been reshaped by the woman seated in 2A. The end. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. I'm curious, what did you think of Maya's journey? Which part hit hardest for you? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. Your voice matters here.